Welcome to the PyData Global Conference. Today we're going to be taking a look at AIQC, an open source library that enables researchers to adopt rapid, rigorous, and reproducible deep learning into their work to push science forward. It handles all of the pre-processing of data, the tracking of experiments, automatically scores and produces charts for every single model, fold, hyperparameter combination that's run, and then also handles inference. Essentially, it's open source MLOps. My name's Layne Sadler. I'm the creator of the library and most recently Director of Product Management at Julia Computing. A bit about the project itself. It just received a nod from the Python Software Foundation in the form of a grant from the Scientific Working Group in order to introduce support for time series preprocessing and analysis into the library. So if you want to check out the source code, it's out there on GitHub, and all of the examples, the different types of analysis and data pipelines that are supported are in notebook format on Read the Docs, so it's extremely easy to follow along with. And if you prefer to just jump on in, then it's a pip install with a one-liner to set up the database so that you can start tracking your experiments. So we're going to begin our description of the problems that AIQC aims to solve with a bit of a thought experiment, looking at a traditional machine learning training exercise. Imagine that we've split our data into training data that we're feeding into our model and then evaluating it on the test data. So we're seeing an accuracy of 88% on the training data, and the test data is not quite performing so well. So we're going to make some changes to our model, our parameters, and architecture. And we see that both improve. The training data is pretty much done. But we're going to continue using what we've learned to influence our model. We're going to push it. We're going to change our parameters and our architecture. And we see that finally our test data is done, right? And this, plain and simple, is evaluation bias. We've effectively used our entire data set to influence the model. And you might be thinking to yourself, no, we only use the training data. That's all we revealed to the model. But there's actually a second neural network in play here. And it's not artificial, it's biological, right? It's us. We, as practitioners, are seeing how our model performs on the test data, the holdout data. And we're making changes to our model based on that repeatedly. So we're using all of the data to change our parameters. And that's where evaluation bias comes from. I learned this from the Fast AI O'Reilly book. I can't take credit for it, but it really got me to think about validation splits and how important they are. Okay, so we're sold on validation splits. Now, how do we actually implement them? Based on what I saw, maybe the APIs have changed. I couldn't find an easy way. Most things were still designed around the original train test split. And if you wanted to introduce your own validation split, you had to just split again. It had implications for stratification, but this kind of involved math, and I thought that sounds like something a framework could solve. Another area where leakage can occur with respect to your holdout and validation splits is encoding. So let's say that you have decided to encode on your entire data set, and maybe you're just taking something simple like an average. If you have high values in your test and validation data, that's going to influence your encoder. It's going to influence your average. So this is a form of data leakage. And what you're supposed to do is fit on your training data and then transform or encode each split or fold separately. And this folding becomes pretty impractical by hand when you consider that you've got this rotating validation split and you need to encode each differently. It's pretty infeasible. So here's an example of encoding, right? We've got planet, a categorical, distance to the sun, call it an integer, continuous, and then is gaseous, right? A Boolean. And we're going to apply different encoders to those, right? So if we one-hot encode, standard scale, and binarize our features, then we're left with pretty unhuman readable features. And when it comes time to do metrics to compare to the original data, or produce human readable charts, or do comparisons of models, or inference actual predictions, you better hope that you saved those encoders so that you can actually decode your data to make it human readable. And you have to do this for every single model, which is equal to the number of hyperparameter combinations you have times the 1 for splits and then many for folds. So there's a lot to keep track of, a lot of moving pieces. Additionally, this post-processing process varies based on the type of analysis that you're conducting. So as you can see here, I've got a confusion matrix on the screen, and it has different splits associated with it, as it should. But you wouldn't do that chart for a regression analysis, right? You're going to have different types of metrics and charts based on the analysis that you're conducting. And that's kind of hard to pick up on if you're someone new to the space. It sounds like something for a framework to solve. Additionally, pre-processing, aside from just the type of analysis you want to conduct, there's different data types, there's many different types of dimensions, right? Like you could analyze data over time, then you have one sample for a single subject over time, and then modality introduces multiple features for a given sample. So tabular data is easy, it's just a table. Then sequence data over time, you start to have multiple tables. And then image data is, channels, and there's just many different tables that you need to know how to coordinate, how to encode, how to decode, and how to jam into your training model. So again, sounds like a good problem for a framework to solve. Here's an example of sliding windows. So when you're doing forecasting, you want to look forward into the future, and then you have to treat each slide as a sample. And if you're doing multivariate feature encoding, it's pretty much impossible to do by hand, so you need a framework for that problem. Thank you to the Python Software Foundation. So models themselves, they're really only made to be run with a snapshot of the parameters that they have. They're not designed to be fed a soup of hyperparameters and different architectures. So if you have different hyperparameters that you want to feed in, that's pretty easy in AIQC, and it's going to tell you, based on all the different models that you have as a multi-model framework, how they're performing, right? So each dot you see here is training, validation, test. So I can very easily pick out the models that are performing consistently and are going to generalize well based on different metrics of my choosing, based on the type of analysis that was conducted. So to summarize the problems that AIQC aims to solve, I looked for experiment trackers that would kind of fit the bill and solve these problems, but I found them inadequate or commercial. I didn't want to do command line stuff. I was working with all these different Python libraries. I just wanted something that would integrate directly with them. And I didn't want it to run alongside and kind of like keep track of things. I wanted to structure the analysis. I wanted to run multiple models using my hyperparameters. And I wanted those different models to know which split and or fold to use. And I wanted the charts automatically done for me. I didn't want to make them myself. Additionally, when I started to design the architecture of this application, I said, my user doesn't know how to configure a database, and they don't want to manage that. They don't want to be running more command line stuff. I'll just handle all the database interaction for them, right? And it needs to handle inference too. It's not enough just to track it, and then you've got this model. It's when you're training the model and you're encoding the data, that's where the fit happens. You need to save that fit so that you can decode predictions during inference. And I didn't want to. Yeah, Cloud SaaS was a no-go. So a lot of the most manual part of this that I was able to automate is the post-processing that's respective to the type of analysis being conducted, the decoding, calculating the performance metrics, doing the different charts based on the type of analysis, and then finally comparing all the different models in one place. And I didn't want to have to manually do all of that again during inference, right? Because what's the point if you're already doing it during evaluation? And I think a key point that scientists, why this is called QC is it's quality control, right? It's a rigorous, well-defined protocol that researchers can follow. And when you're learning deep learning, you're just kind of scrounging through online blogs and trying to piece together bits of documentation to figure out, am I doing this right? And that's not how science works. You're supposed to have a very rigorous protocol, and you're supposed to know what you're doing, and AIQC provides bumper rails that help with that. It doesn't talk about machine learning in terms of X and Y and math. It talks about things that we understand, features and labels. These are objects, and we should treat them as such, and their absence as such. So a scientist isn't a data scientist necessarily, right? They might know some of the pieces and how to put them together and how to structure experiments, but they're fundamentally not programmers, and all of the stuff that I'm describing requires a lot of manual programming because it's not, these frameworks aren't finished. Deep learning is in its infancy. Machine learning is in its infancy still. We have so far to go when you look at differentiable programming. Now, we described some of the different ways that data leakage of our holdout can occur, right? And you can solve this by doing validation splits, but if your framework doesn't support validation splits, that's a major problem. What if you want to use validation splits with crossfolds and you want to fit uniquely on, you don't want to fit your validation fold, right? That's a problem that AIQC solves. How do you save your encoders? We've talked about that. And then actually, what sample IDs did I actually use? If you can't answer that, that's something you would want to answer in a 6th grade science experiment. We should be able to say, I trained my model on these samples. So if you want to question me about bias, have at it. And then pre-processing tools. This is extremely painful. They're really designed for 2D data, sometimes 1D data, which is even more painful than 3D data. So how do I encode, even in 2D data, how do I encode different columns and D types uniquely, right? So you need to slice out each query that fits and then encode them and then concatenate them all back together in the end. It's really challenging in 2D data, and then it's worse in 5D data. So when you start to work with time series data and image data, that's where things go off the rails, because you're finding yourself coordinating all of this encoding and decoding. The decoding's even worse because you have to reverse engineer it instead of just engineering it. You have to say, this data was encoded, how do I decode it? So those are the problems that can make deep learning challenging, make your head spin. And I thought, can I design a framework that's easy, that is object-oriented, that solves all of this with high-level APIs for new practitioners and low-level APIs for people that really want to jump in and customize things. And I believe I've struck that balance with AIQC. It's a Python package that you can download. You ingest your data using different data types, tabular, sequence, image, supports in-memory formats as well as file-based formats to ingest your data. You can perform unbiased pre-processing on different types of data by encoding uniquely on your splits and or folds. It handles stratification in all the different areas that normal libraries don't support stratification, and it allows you to keep track of every single sample that's going into a split and or fold. Then comes time for tuning. You define your hyperparameters in Python, and you treat each component of the model, training, loss, building the model itself, the optimizer, as a different component and a function, so that you can pass parameters into them that you define, not only values, but also architectures. So it's extremely flexible. In structuring the analysis, it actually makes it more flexible. And then those jobs know what data they're supposed to talk to, because that's all coordinated in the backend through the API. And my favorite part is that as soon as you click run, you're pretty much done, because all the metrics are going to be laid out for you based on the type of analysis that you conducted. It says classification regression. It also supports unsupervised, which is actually really just kind of a type of regression. And then you can do all of this again during inference, it's entirely reproducible because it's recorded. All the steps that you've chosen are recorded in the database that's automatically set up when you run AIQC.setup. So end to end, your workflow is reproducible. All right, demo time. So whenever I install AIQC, I'm pretty certain it's going to work because all it needs is access to a Python 3 shell and any operating system. It doesn't matter if it's Mac, Windows, WSL, or a different distribution of Linux. It's pretty low level. All it needs to do is create a SQLite file, and that's what AIQC.setup is. And if you want to see where that lives, it's using apters to route it to a proper directory, which is essentially like the new home directory, apters, right? So here you can see the SQLite file. And AIQC is going to act as an ORM between that database and your experiments for the purpose of persistence and reproducibility. There's a ton of dummy data baked in for testing many different types of analysis that the framework supports. Here you can see I've imported the iris dataset, my favorite. It's what I learned on. We've got a label column of species that's a categorical of type object, and then we've got many different feature columns that are floats. Right? So now we're going to begin to prepare the data. And this is where the magic starts to happen, right? My favorite part of this framework is actually the pre-processing, not the experiment tracking. So it supports different types of data, tabular, sequence, and image. You can use in-memory file formats, in-memory or file formats, right? So here I'm just going to run with the data frame, and I'm not going to change any of the D types. For the labels, I'm going to take that species column. It's not a time series data, so I'm not going to do any interpolation. And I'm going to say, let's one-hot encode those labels. I left this blank because I just overwrite any defaults that won't work. The feature pre-processing, I'm going to leave out. You can include or exclude columns. So I'm going to leave out species columns and work with all those float columns. Again, it's not time series data, so we don't need to worry about this. And then we're going to do multiple types of encoders just for fun. So we'll take that first column here, we'll apply one encoder to it, and then the remaining floats will apply standard scalar to it. And then this isn't a crazy dimensionality problem. We don't need any reshaping. We're not going to do any cross-folding. And we are going to introduce a validation split and a test split. And because this isn't a regression problem, we don't need to worry about stratifying our bins. But yeah, this is the high-level API. There's a low-level API if you want to go in here and tweak even more stuff. Now we get to design our experiment. So there's different functions: build, train, and down here you can see lose, optimize, predict. These are the different components of a model, right? So we've got a pretty basic Keras sequential model here. And you can see I've got different arguments that are predefined. And this is all in the documentation, but we make it easy for you by helping you identify what the shape of your features are. You just call it. And then we pass in the hyperparameters that you define below. So again, based on the type of analysis you've defined, you've got different arguments that are going to be passed in, and the samples are pre-processed for you, so we might as well just hand those off to you, right? Now, the hyperparameters are pretty neat because they can be values or they can just be conditionals, right? So I could say, like, if fourth layer is true, run. And then I can have true and false as a hyperparameter and then run different architectures just by tweaking that simple Boolean, right? Now we pass these things into the experiment. This is the second object of the high-level API, right? So split set is not defined, so I must have not run this cell here. My bad. And as you can see, it tests the encoders that we've defined and sequentially. So it says, hey, sepal length, that was the first one. The remaining columns that you have that you can encode are these. Great. So now I'm going to say, I'm going to work with that, that D type here and grab all those and encode that next. That's how that sequential encoding works, right? So now I'm going to go ahead and instantiate that queue object. That doesn't do anything. It just gets the queue ready. So within here, we're saying Keras. You can do old school TensorFlow if you want. It also supports PyTorch. Again, that's all in the documentation. This is a classification multi-problem that has implications for our labels. It has implications for the types of metrics that we want to render. The framework handles all of that for us. We pass in our build and train function. We leave these buddies blank. You can customize them if you want, and I plan to. And then you just take those hyperparameters we defined up here, just drag and drop them into the experiment. Grid search feels a little much, so I'm just going to take 66% of the combinations of these hyperparameters. There's different strategies that you can apply here. You point it at that split set as the source of data, and you don't need a fold set. You need both because a test split is not in a fold set. And then I'm only going to repeat this once because this is a non-deterministic process. You could repeat it 3 times if you wanted to, and it's going to give you a different result each time. And then hide test is set to false. So we've staged that multiple times now, and now I'm going to go ahead and run it. And what this is going to do is it's just going to queue up those models and then execute them one by one. And what we're going to see is that it's automatically calculating the performance metrics and charts for all of those. So all we have to do is focus on the architecture that we want to run. That's really the beauty of it, is you just focus on the pre-processing. It's all about revealing the right data to the right architecture, and then voila, it should just work. That's what artificial intelligence is about. So this is the boomerang chart. It shows you all the models that you trained. Looks like we've got some interesting ones here. And here you can see this orange guy, right? So I've got my train split, I've got my test split and validation split, and they're all above 96%, and they're pretty consistent. This one's a little lossy, the validation, but it's only 18%, so I'll let that slide. And then if I want to see, a specific model, I can dive into the learning curve of it, and that's interactive again. All the classification metrics are ready to go. So if you want to take a look at your rock curve and see what's really going on, classification, confusion matrices are done for every single split and or fold. So you can see exactly what's going on. So you can see, oh, here, like my actual label was versicolor, but this classified it as virginica. That's nice to have, especially in medical scenarios. Precision recall, and then finally, just to cap it all off, Google Colab isn't great with pandas. So here are, for every single model, every single split, you've got all the metrics if you want to manually inspect them. Thank you for tuning in to this talk about AIQC. If you are a researcher, I hope this makes it easy for you to integrate deep learning into your research. When I think about the future of AIQC, it's twofold. One, taking things to the cloud so that models can be parallelized and shared, persisted for collaborative purposes and reproducibility purposes. 2, adding support for different types of analyses. Not mentioned here, near and dear to my heart, are graph neural networks and generative adversarial networks. AIQC is well positioned to handle GANs and treat them kind of as branches so you can get good results quickly. And last but not least, I want to say thank you to PyData for hosting this conference and inviting me to give a talk. So thank you very much.